And welcome to the fifth podcast of Jono Talks. I am here today with Adam Jacobs. Adam is a Melbourne-based comedian, actor and writer who has performed across Australia. He also has a podcast called Off Topic on SoundCloud, published a 158-page book called The End As I Know It, and directed, wrote and starred in the feature film Random, It's a Small Town Thing. Adam, is there anything you cannot do?
Is there anything I cannot do? Well, it depends. If you, in terms of zoology, which is one area of the human, I don't know what we call it, part of the human condition, really, isn't it? Because we started with sort of understanding the husbandry of animals. I don't know why that began, except for the fact that they just started hanging around. I mean, why not? We are a wasteful sort of breed, aren't we? Right. There's always things to scavenge. I've noticed that myself. I wake up in the morning, often I don't even have to get out of bed. I've still got leftovers. It's just surrounding the bed, and that seems to get me through. But that was sort of November, December last year, and I've since vacuumed and I brought in some professional cleaners. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. So, and how about comedy? How did you first become interested in comedy?
Comedy? Well, I don't know if I found comedy or if comedy found me. Oh, what a hack response that is. Comedy. I think there's this theory that people are born funny. And this is philosophically challengeable, I would like to assert. Yeah. Because, no one exclusively owns funny. So in this way, I think we all kind of are comedians. Yeah. Jono? For instance, the fact that your last name's Talks. Come on now. If people aren't making fun of you about that, if you're not trying that on at parties, Jono Talks is my podcast, is what I do. I said, oh, really? Is your last name Talks? Yeah, it's Talks. Yeah, that's my last name. My middle name is Mumbles or something. But, okay, so there's an opportunity for everyone to be funny. Yeah. When you decide to make the step into becoming a comedian, which I'm still in the process of doing, then I suppose you're formalising what it is and how it is that you yourself as an individual are uniquely funny.
Mm-hmm. But how did you get started off professionally? Did you go through did you do any university-related courses to get involved, or was it more just getting out there on stage?
Well, I did do my PhD in stand-up, of course. There is no such thing. Yeah. Okay. No, I went to uni and I did a performance degree, I suppose. So I trained as an actor. I did education as well. So it was kind of like a teaching degree, I guess. And so through that experience, I obviously had a chance to develop lots of performance skills. Yeah. And out of that came a sort of liking for comedy without it being a sort of predominant feeling that I had that I wanted to be a comedian as such. Yeah. But after a while, it was sort of effortless to be kind of funny as opposed to being sort of anything else, which for obvious reasons can be more challenging. So I ended up favouring comedic roles as opposed to dramatic roles, I guess, and this is a pretty common story for a lot of comedians, I think. Yeah. And eventually I got into sort of musical theatre and a bit of comedy theatre as well. And then I started thinking, hey, I don't have to just read other people's jokes off the page. Yeah. Why I write some of my own. Yeah, exactly. Hey! And that's where that happened.
So basically you started off as something for fun, basically, or did you always want to do it professionally?
Well, I didn't. I can't say I always wanted to do it professionally. I suppose for people in my kind of category, the mainstream acting was the first sort of priority. And then outside of that, eventually I started looking at my own creations, which we'll talk about, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly.
And then realised, there's a whole bunch of weirdness going on with my own writing, even though longer format concepts like feature films and what have you and books, what happens if I just isolate those little pearls of weirdness? Are they kind of jokes? Are they? Am I? oh my gosh, am I writing jokes? When did this happen? So it was like that kind of thing. And then I thought, well, I'm gonna pluck the eyes out of all this waffle that I'm going on about.
Yeah.
And see if I can just put together a whole bunch of jokes. And yeah, and I was very aroused by that process and quite happy with the material that I was generating. Not that I thought it was guaranteed laughs or anything, but it stimulated something inside me that made me feel alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And because I can see right now on the desk you have kind of like a mini book. I'm assuming that this is where you write your jokes. And for instance,
yes.
do you just do like kind of free roam, like just write whatever you think comes in your head and just write it down?
Are we talking about process here?
Yeah, we are.
Process? Well, I'm sure. And this probably leads into a question that you might ask about advice to people who want to give comedy a crack.
Yeah.
How do you get started? Where do you begin? And I suppose this is true too. It comes back to what you were saying too about when does a person begin to accept that there's a way in which they can be funny in a formal sense that is then termed stand-up. Mm-hmm. Because in the first instance, you should be looking at yourself sort of remotely, so to speak, observing yourself in the social setting and getting a sense of how it is that you are funny. Because everyone is sort of different in very sort of subtle ways, So first, find that uniqueness in yourself. And then outside of that, it is really about observation. And everything is really a joke. And that's the hard thing often for people to accept, because certain situations in life will present to you a whole canon of premises. And you'll think, wow, that's fantastic. Like, for instance, you'll be looking at, you might go into a news agency, and you'll see a whole, there's rows and rows and rows of stacks of glossy magazines. Glossy magazines, they call them glossy magazines because it's all glossy, the pages are all... That's what they want, because it's glamour, and it's prestige and all these things. And that hard copy form is always attached to those notions of glamour and prestige. Mm. However, we know that with the changes in media, that eventually all hard copy formats are going to, no longer exist.
Yeah.
So what happens to the glossy magazine? What are they going to do about that? Where's Harper's going to go? Where's GQ going to go? Where are these magazines? How are they going to get that prestige and that exclusivity built into their product now that the hard copy version doesn't exist? So what is the thing they're going to sacrifice? Because really, if they're going to hold on to the hard copy format, then they've got to sacrifice something. Obviously, they're not going to sacrifice the glossiness, because that's the whole purpose of the content.
Yeah.
It's to remain that sort of exclusive, high-end sort of appearance. So eventually, you're just going to end up with glossy magazines with one page in them. But that one page is going to be really glossy. In fact, it's going to be so glossy that it's more like a mirror. If the lighting conditions are wrong, you won't be able to. There's too much glare. You won't be able to read it anyway. But it doesn't matter, because there'll be no content. There's only one page. So, you begin to... That's an example of just observing in the first instance.
Yeah.
Glossy magazines, they're a real energy sort of demanding kind of built product that takes a lot of work to generate, to come out and then produce something that is very high-end in its appearance. Okay, but that's going to die soon. So what happens after that? What happens as that death sort of evolves?
Yeah.
And so that's when you begin to make the associations. So the associations is the next thing. Observe, and then do your links to associations. Now, the associations could be a consequence, or they could be association with something else that is in opposition.
Okay.
So when it comes to all jokes, and this, I'll be challenged on this in the future, I'm sure, because Jono Talks podcast is going to go global, man. So I will be challenged on this. But all jokes are essentially an observation of reality that is coming in conflict with a desire. It's reality in conflict with a desire. So if you have a joke that you've written yourself, and it's sort of come out of organically, just out of walking down the street and making an observation. Write it down and then break it down. Identify what is the reality and what is the desire that it's coming in conflict with. So, for instance, in my magazine example, which isn't a joke of mine necessarily, I just plucked it. It's just an idea I kind of had yesterday sort of thing.
Yeah.
The reality is hard copy's dying.
Yeah.
That's the reality. The desire is, but we've invested so much in this product. We want to keep it going. So desire is about want, need, longing for. That's all the desire stuff. We want to keep it going. So whilst that reality doesn't change, which is obviously not going to, print media is going to die, and there's a consistency with the desire, then there's going to be a consequence. And hopefully, as you begin to unpack that, the consequence gives you something that's surprising to the audience or funny,
Yeah.
So so people are sort of starting out, get your ideas, write them down, see where the conflict is between the desire and reality. It will be there somewhere. And then that can begin to be the shape that you adopt towards writing other jokes.
Could that process be reversed, though, if a stand-up comedian wanted to write about something fictional as opposed to...
Well, yes, and you've said that because that's more or less what I do. I think I do not really enjoy mentioning words like Tony or Abbott or...
Yeah,
like
it's an easy one.
I don't really enjoy that sort of stuff. And mainly because there's other people who do it, and I think they probably do it better than I do.
Have you heard of Elliot Loney?
I have.
Yes, he does a lot of those. He kind of mocks Tony Abbott when he was fighting it. Yeah, he was hilarious.
He was. So so that's fine. Whereas I like to be a little bit more absurd, but it doesn't mean that I don't want to be on topic necessarily. Or be off topic. So you can still be political without having to sort of name drop. And so I'm a little bit more in the absurdist space. So, for example, like I would write a joke about like animal onesies. Like onesies is a sort of a now thing, kind of, like people are sort of like, oh yeah, it used to be just the thing that kids did, but now you got these furries running around doing weird things and together, and we won't go into it. But like they're adults or whatever. So it's kind of like, okay, there's a now thing that I could speak to, and also it's a kind of silly thing because hey, it's a bit Monty Python, and that's kind of where I come from. It's my generation. So it's like, what can I do with that? And it's kind of like, well, yeah, okay. What's something that everyone's going to connect with that somehow is associated to? Of course, roadkill. Excellent. So what you do is you keep an animal onesie in the boot of your car, don't you? You're driving around at night. You happen to hit somebody. Hey, you just stuff the body into the onesie suit, don't you? It could have been manslaughter, but now. Yeah, it's just roadkill, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's a weird conversation you have with a police officer, of course. So yes, officer, I do agree with you. There was a particularly large bunny rabbit, and strange that he was riding a bike. So that's where I'm at. I like to get people into another kind of reality. Whilst I'm still associating everyday and sort of topical things. Not that really onesies is a topical thing, but you know what I mean, like now things, so that the world in which I create is not so obscure.
Does it take practice to one visualize that obscurity and then to verbalize it to an audience?
Oh, absolutely. The thinking is the most important thing to practice, because if you don't continue to train your brain, then you can miss things as you're going around in your life. And a comedian who happy to call themselves a comedian who is missing things isn't really a comedian. So you've got to have that observational thing always turned on, and I don't think it really matters who you are in terms of your ability as a comedian. Every comedian will tell you that. So, yeah. So the thing is to be training the thinking, and that can take the form of identifying where the conflict is between the reality and desire. A lot of the time, that's not a bad place to start. Obviously, the best place to start is when something just occurs to you organically, and you just know that instinctively it's funny. So then you go, right, I don't need to understand the mechanics behind it. I've got the joke is there. I'm writing it.
Yeah, I think so. It kind of comes from that, subconscious level where it just comes naturally. Well, for instance, we were talking about the Jono Talks name. When I was trying to think of a podcast name, I was just like, that one was literally the first one that just popped into my head, and then I was trying to mess around with it like a comedian would, just scratching it, thinking of other names to do. But the Jono Talks one just came. Just like, I don't know how, just organically.
It's good.
Yeah.
And not only is it more or less accurate, unless I'm on, because I'll do the talking. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's very... it says exactly what it is that's going on, and it has your name in it as well, which is important.
Well,
so it puts your stamp on it, which is important, not because you are looking to promote yourself in some sort of neon light kind of way, but it's really important with a product that people know what they're sort of getting, what they're tapping into. Yeah. So. And you've also built in a lot of freedom with it. You haven't been so narrow, Yeah. And it sounds quite silly. Jono Talks, it's kind of like you could talk about anything. And as you explained to me earlier, that's exactly what you want to do. So.
Yeah, but I think it wasn't so much that I liked it. It just kind of came out like it's instinctively, and then I just ran with it because when I was trying to do. Is there anything? Have you researched the power behind thoughts or anything that come automatically to you? So, like jokes and stuff. Is there a certain mystery behind it, or
no? I haven't really looked into it too much, except that understanding what is happening when the conflicts are arranged within an idea, then you can then transplant that concept or that sort of formula to other observations and concepts that you may think up.
Yeah.
But in the first instance comes a sort of an organic way of building a set of maybe a set of jokes. So in the first instance, you'll think something is funny, and it is then that you'll go back and you'll see, why is that funny?
Yeah.
And then once you start trying to replicate that funny, what you're doing is you're training your brain to then automatically see other things as funny. So instead of just being, and you can be passive, you can just go, right, I had that idea. I was just sitting on the train. It just came to me. I didn't even have to try. It's kind of like, so I'll just do that, and that's fine. But it might take you 3 years to build 5 minutes of material, like really good material, or 10 minutes of really good material. And that's fine because you're just sitting back and letting it happen. And that's really not a bad way to go. But if you want to be a little bit more proactive, then yes, you can push yourself into a kind of, you can use your own organically born ideas to help structure other jokes that will be probably really bad, but they're training what's going on up here.
Yeah.
So when you are out in the world, you will be triggering those sort of organic responses, and they'll be coming to you a little bit more frequently than what they would otherwise, if you were just passively engaging in the world. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, absolutely, and I think
that's what I think anyway.
Yeah. And I think now it's time to talk about like some of your projects that you've done. So So with your podcast, Off Topic.
Oh well, yes.
Did that come automatically to you? How did that come about?
Look, the Off Topic came about with a friend of mine, Timothy David Mitchell. He's quite sensitive about how he is perceived in the industry. However, he's put his name to this podcast, Off Topic, so I'm sure he doesn't mind if I mention him. And the reason why I put that disclaimer in is because Off Topic is essentially about nothing. Really. In fact, we do everything we can to not stay on a topic.
Yeah, I know, because when I was listening, it was really funny, but sometimes I had absolutely no idea. Like, you're kind of following a tangent. I didn't really know what I was following. I was kind of going left, right. It's like, was that the purpose behind it?
It was.
Yeah.
In a way, it's kind of making fun of the idea of podcasts to a certain extent, and hopefully providing maybe an alternative to the fully engaged thing that a lot of podcasts ask you to be.
Yeah.
You know, so, and often, you know, if you're not tuned in every single second as it's going along and you miss a little thing, it's kind of like, what was that? You know, and then you lose your way. Whereas with us, we will, a tangent will present itself as it always does in any conversation, and we will pursue that tangent and leave everything that came before it behind. Now, we don't do that really strictly. Like, we generally try and stay within the confines. However, I think in one particular session, we started with just notions of God, really, and what happened as the universe was forming. Yeah. And we ended with a staircase leading into the depths of the ocean, in search of a mythical key that unlocked something to do with.
How did you end up there?
Unicorns and rainbows, I can't remember. So it was really just this idea of the degrees of separation is more or less what's happened, what's motivating it. Yeah, and without any real formula applied. However, if you understand that idea of the degrees of separation, really, you can go to pretty much any subject, notion, concept, person in the world with very few steps if you're willing to not close the door on anything. And there's a good game that you can play, like, when you're younger or at school or whatever, where you kind of go, okay, let's do the Wikipedia game, where I want you to start at fishing for salmon in Tasmania. So bring up that page. Yeah. And I want you to end with, farming watermelons at the Amazon. And then you say, okay, you have to just through the active links on a page, get to that, and you have to do it within 7 clicks. And if you can do it in less, then you're the winner or whatever. Like those sort of that's ability to sort of move from one thing to another without feeling the hindrance of being tied into a subject, being tied into a specific sort of genre or topic for a certain period of time. It can be really freeing for the imagination, and especially if you are looking at doing writing or stand-up comedy, then little techniques like that are very effective, I think, in opening your mind to the associations that you can build. Because often, there's like with comedy writing, and I heard this just recently, which was quite good. I think it's something that comes from a Chris Wainhouse way of looking at comedy, and he's a great, really good stand-up in Australia, professional dude. He basically says you start with a premise or an idea, and then you write down. You unpack it, like you get your punchlines. And for the first 3 to 8, they'll be the ones that the audience will predict. The audience will see that all coming. It's then when you get to about the 8th or 9th one, where you force yourself to get more and more obscure, you're still building this. The associations are not obscure. Like the audience is still with you. But it's when you get down into the bottom of that list, that's when you start getting the new stuff, the new associations that the audience wouldn't expect. And when you get that, then you get surprise and then you get laughter. Okay, and anything that allows you to get to that sort of more obscure stuff quicker, such as training your imagination, not being afraid to be random, then do it.
Yeah, and I guess that perfectly leads into your feature film that you directed, which is called Random, It's a Small Town Thing.
Well, how coincidental.
Yeah, how coincidental. So there was a quote at the start of the movie which I would like you to explain to me. Life must be allowed to surprise you. If you deny it that opportunity, it will impose upon you a burden of numbness. Why did you start off with that quote, and what does it mean in the context of the movie you made?
Okay, well, the movie is about life in a small town, and it operates on the premise that within a small town, there's generally sort of three groups of people. Those people who grew up there, lived there, and are faithful to the idea that this town is just fantastic. Those people who want to leave because they feel suffocated and they know that the world's a bigger place and they want the freedom and they want to explore. And those people who are running away from something. They need the seclusion, they need the anonymity. So it follows three characters that are all suffering the effects of each one of those things. Mm-hmm. And in the process of justifying why they feel that way about small town living, philosophical sort of notions like this are introduced. So in this particular instance, this guy happens to think, look, if you don't take a risk, then you're not going to be rewarded with anything, really. Nothing changes if nothing changes. And this idea of the burden of numbness. Now, in many ways, numbness is not a bad thing. We're not feeling anything sort of negative. We're not really feeling anything positive either. We're sort of in a stasis.
Neutral, yeah.
Yeah. So it's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But this idea of being a burden, numbness being a burden, hopefully, and the listeners sort of is trying to make, in the attempt trying to make sense of that, they realise, oh yeah, okay, so what that means is with numbness comes a sort of resignation and a sense of defeat, I suppose, to a certain extent, and that can feel like a weight.
Yeah. Do you take this holistic approach of obscurity and randomness with most things you do in life? Because I'm just getting a vibe where you told me about stand-up comedy, and kind of looking for something that's outside of the box, not following that tangent. Do you, with even random as a small town thing, do you always try and find things that don't conform or normally conform to a particular genre? Or
well, yeah, and I suppose like the films like a Wes Anderson, like Rushmore and or Life Aquatic, and the Grand Budapest Hotel and movies like that, where the main story thread is interrupted rather abruptly at times with things that apparently don't seem to make sense. Yeah. However, they do connect to the world. They're the films and the ideas. They're a bit like Monty Python as well. You could say that they've put randomness, the knob on, as far as randomness, because they're turned it way up. But when in anything that they do, all the elements are somehow still connected to the world in which they're presenting.
Oh yeah.
So even when Brian is momentarily abducted by aliens in the life of Brian,
I was about to bring that up. Actually,
4 seconds of footage is all it is really. That beautifully ties in this notion of, well, the universe is a big place. There's a lot in it that we still don't understand. It connects back to the idea of the Big Bang and to science, to where does God fit into all that. Yeah. So this even though it appears so terribly random, it's actually just accentuating the bigger commentary that the film's pushing. So in that way, I know that with any sort of matrix of meaning, there is a whole bunch of redundancy that can be accessed that has to be there for the main thing to exist. It's like all the stuff that you like, all this fan Star Wars movies that are created about obscure characters that are on the periphery of the main story. That's true, actually. What does that stormtrooper do when he goes home, and has to talk to his wife and his kid, like Robot Chicken? All that noise is maybe completely uninteresting, but it's still there, and it's still accessible, and it has to be there in order for the main story to exist. So that's what I kind of like to do. I kind of like to look and say, okay, let's see if we can justify some of this superfluous stuff because we know that it has to exist.
Yeah, and with The Life of Brian, with that, they kind of mocked the whole, when Jesus Christ lived, and I think John Cleese made the movie. Are you a fan of him?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
He's done some stand-up comedy in Melbourne as well, I think.
Yeah, well, he's still getting around, isn't he? I don't know if he's still right at this moment. I guess he could be, but yes, up until very recently, I think. He did a tour not so long ago and stated to everyone that he had to hit the road again.
Yeah.
Because he's owed his wife a lot of money for the divorce they'll go through.
Yes, yeah.
Which I don't know if it's a joke or whether it's true. It's probably a bit of both, but it's funny. But yeah, he's a great ambassador for absurdity and randomness.
Yeah.
At the same time, without being so stupid and so silly that the audience still can't connect with it. And I do the short joke thing. I'm not really as close to being a one-liner as a one-liner is likely to get, sort of thing. But I do hopefully. I believe that there is still a interest in the other reality. And that comedy doesn't always have to be about Tony Abbott and feminism and racial issues and ISIS and whatever. Which I still talk about all those things.
Yeah.
But in my own context.
Yeah.
So and that context is okay. There's another dimension out there that has to exist. That sure, not everyone's going to be eager to get into necessarily because it's a bit psychedelic. But it's there, and it has to be acknowledged. So come with me, and maybe I can get you into it for a little bit, and we can take all these heavy issues, and we can just be a little bit silly with it, And every comedian's doing that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that I'm elitist in some particular way, but when I say silly with it, I mean really kind of abstract, really sort of absurd in many ways, step into that space for an hour and then get back to the heavier side of issues. So that's what I invite people to do.
Yeah, and I guess with John Cleese, he also made a series called Fawlty Towers, and where he was like the hotel guy, and that was really quite. Well, sometimes occasionally you'd see really mean boss owners, but he was kind of, in the series, he was depicting himself in the public as well, getting angry with like the hotel assistant. That was a really good series, and it kind of takes that notion where it's obscure but not too obscure as well. Do you think there's a fine line?
Well, yeah, you're walking the line of reality. Where does the reality? Because the audience is asked at any point. Doesn't matter what the format is or what the medium is. Whether you're watching YouTube or you're watching a movie or you're watching stand-up, professional, amateur, whatever it might be, you are asking the audience to suspend their disbelief. Now, you'll push the audience to the edge of doing that. As soon as they kind of get to the point where it's kind of like, nah, man, I don't believe it anymore. And that can happen, and it happens like a lot with dramatic films, with action films. People often criticise, especially when films start to become corny and words like that are being used to describe it. It's kind of like, people are basically saying, I'm more intelligent than the dialogue you're giving me. I've got better brains in my head than what you think I've got. So let's smarten up the talk. Let's make the ideas a little bit more, you can be tech heavier with your references or whatever it might be. Sometimes films, for example, are put into production where the script is almost 2 years out of date before the actual film can even come onto the screen.
That's a good point.
So a lot happens in that time, and that's where clever script writing will sort of future-proof itself. But that's a separate issue. Anyway, and this is just my thoughts, by the way. I'm not saying that I'm attached to any real notion of what's actually going on in pop culture, because preferably I'd rather not be. But anyway, so when it comes to pushing the audience into areas of where the reality, accepting what reality is, becomes challenging, then you still need to have those anchor points back into what is familiar to the audience.
Yeah.
And that can be, and the great way Fawlty Towers does that is that we have all been to those hotels. We've all been to those, we've all been on short stays to those regional places where they're owner operated, and we've always asked the question, what's really going on behind the scenes? And just because of that one little bit of mystery, then allows you to do a whole bunch of crazy random stuff.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that is built into the premise. And that is what's really clever about it. And that's where a lot of good comedy works really well. And that's where you need to be that observer. You need to go, okay, when that kitchen door closes, I don't actually know what's going on in that kitchen. I don't know what they're really doing with preparing my food. I don't know what the relationship is between the chef and the waiters, Yeah. And then suddenly it's like bang, 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 bang. I could do anything.
Yeah.
Once those doors close. And that's what Fawlty Towers does, And also, another really good thing that Fawlty Towers does is it builds in vulnerability with all the characters.
Yes, yeah.
And you have to be vulnerable on stage to some extent. That's my experience, and also everything that I've ever learnt from professional comedians. And what they say is it's easier for the audience to have some sympathy for you.
Yeah, because if you're kind of like an indomitable figure, then the audience can't really connect with you. And yeah,
and it's true even with big comedians like Louis C.K. and Bill Burr and those guys. People say, yeah, but they're really hard-hitting. They're talking about stuff that's confrontational. People are kind of like they're telling people that they're stupid, and all the rest of it. But we still have some empathy for those people because think about how the world looks to them. It's a very bleak existence that they occupy. Like Louis C.K. telling himself that it's telling that a child should know that lying is great. A child should know that lying is probably the best thing you could ever do in your whole entire life. To be in the state of mind where you feel that's justifiable to tell a child that is a pretty damaged state of mind. And it's not somewhere that we'd all want to be. It's kind of like, no, that's too dark, man. That's too negative. We couldn't do that. So we still have some empathy for Louis C.K. With Bill Burr, when he talks about, I don't know, like old stuff, like he's got a pit bull. He bought a dog and it's like owning a gun that you can pat. It's kind of like, now, okay, if you know that you're doing that, is that really the healthy state of mind? It's like, I don't think everyone would be wanting to do that. In fact, most people would kind of go, actually, that's kind of the dog I don't want. So it's like you'll find that with all good comedians that there's something about them that we sympathise with, we empathise with. So the Fawlty Towers does that brilliantly. We just feel so sorry for all the characters, really. Yeah. They all have a vulnerability that we kind of makes us want to feel like we are sort of above them. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And would you say this kind of process is analogous to, I'm not sure if you play a music instrument, but say if you were playing piano, you can play, records that have already been made, but once you get into the newer versions, you're always trying to find the different keys to the script. Is that kind of what it comes down to with the obscurity when it comes to comedy? You're always trying to find different ways to look at reality, to look at jokes.
Yeah, I think so. And music's not a bad way to go, especially something like jazz or blues where there's an improvisational element to it, because you are relying on core elements. There are licks and progressions and, sequences that most people in that genre know and are able to play really well. And outside of that, you create your own colour and your own specific flavours. And people like, is it Thelonious Monk? I can never remember if it's a Thelonious Monk or Polonius Monk. I don't know why I get confused about that, because I guess it's because neither one of those things sounds like a first name. But anyway, that dude who's got his last name Monk, who plays the jazz piano, he was beautiful at that. He was very technically proficient. but very innovative with the fact that he took risks on not always having to be really flary, but the discordance that he built into the music was truly unique without being sort of too over the top. And though that sort of uniqueness is something that I think stand-up, any sort of writing really invites you to do.
Yeah.
You're dancing around a common, a familiar format.
Yeah.
And in doing so, hopefully adding your own colour. And that's the challenge for most people is not trying to just do what other people are doing already, or at least not being afraid to be yourself within the boundaries of that particular artistic endeavour.
Yeah, so this kind of reminds me of, the song Viva La Vida by Coldplay. Have you heard of that?
Oh, right,
song?
Yeah.
They kind of copied it. They got some criticism, like obviously they're a popular band. They got some criticism for copying a song in some elements. And when I listened to it, I could hear its similarities, but I could also hear its differences.
Yes.
And with stand-up comedy, is your stand-up comedy in particular purely unique, or do you grab some inspiration from certain... I mean, you've already mentioned some comedians, but do you try and keep it as unique as possible, or do you try and find some common ground?
Right. So I would belong to a school of comedy thinking for sure that certainly probably doesn't include Louis C.K. and doesn't include Bill Burr, but that does include people like Stephen Wright, Mitch Hedberg, and other guys that they're strictly one-liner guys. And yes, so I am quite happy to be to admit that I'm inspired by some very specific people, and their style of comedy informs my ideas in the first instance, because especially with someone like Stephen Wright, because he is able to look for those things. It's like the nose on your face. He's always discovering the nose on your face with an idea. It's something that's always there, but we've just never seen it before, you know. I always had a joke about it. Not a joke, but just something that amuses me. It's kind of like... Charles Darwin discovered evolution. No, he didn't discover evolution. He just noticed something that was always there.
Yeah.
Like the nose on your face has always been there. He just sort of saw it for the first time.
Yeah.
He didn't discover it.
Yeah, right.
So, but the guy who discovered his nose on the face, now he deserves recognition. Remember that Og, the caveman, who first noticed the nose on his face. Now he's someone we should celebrate. Because they're like, look at that,
Yeah.
That's a degree of awareness that brought the human species along, considerably, because it's got that notion of awareness attached to it, which supposedly is the thing that distinguishes us from other animals. So really, Og, who discovered the nose on his face, deserves more celebrity than Charles Darwin does, who just happened to see something that was already there.
Yeah.
So in that way, I like what Stephen Wright does and Mitch Hedberg does, in that they are very efficiently picking up on things that the rest of us that have always been there, but the rest of us, for whatever reason, aren't particular. I guess we aren't motivated enough to see. But once they're revealed, it's kind of like, oh yeah, okay. It's silly, and also something that, wow, it's surprising, because I can now see the world and its layers with more depth.
Yeah, more texture. Yeah, absolutely. And so with your book that you was it self-published?
Yeah, it was self-published. Yeah, and I suppose it's still in process. Really, I was reading it back again not so long ago and thinking, there's some things I could go back over it and change. So in a way, it's sort of like it's not a final draft as such, which is interesting. And I think that, I don't know whether that's detrimental or not, but I haven't pushed it really. I've just made it available on Amazon. It's, what's it called again?
The End As I Know It.
Oh yeah, that's it, yeah. The End As I Know It. The End As I Know It on Amazon. So you can grab it on Kindle, and you can grab it a hard copy version as well if you want. It's very cheap. and it's probably something that I'll revisit again towards generating another edition. The thing with the book is that I wanted to create something that was a sort of bad attempt by somebody to... Well, no, it was a brave attempt by somebody to write out of their genre. So the person who tells the story is actually a sort of scientist who, at the time, at sort of post-war period to World War II, was looking at where science was going and trying to predict the future. So he would have a whole bunch of scientific peoples that he would be writing for that would then use his work to inform what they did. But he also inadvertently attracted a whole bunch of what would become sci-fi fans who enjoy this idea that, the future might be this and might be that, So he was sort of like in the forefront of the sci-fi sort of thing. Well, he was part of a certain type of sci-fi that we are now very familiar with. So he was kind of in two minds about how he was perceived in the community, but inadvertently got caught up in his own sort of science fiction saga, which affected his family and how he would live for the rest of his life. It had this major impact on his life, this governmental thing initiative that he got involved in. And so he's telling that story about this initiative. And so in a way he's writing about the sci-fi elements, but it's more about how it affected his family unit, and so it's more emotional and in that regard. So he's a science fiction writer writing out of genre. He's writing out of his genre.
Yeah, it comes back to that randomness kind of component.
Yeah. So he uses different language, and he doesn't really know how to do it properly. So there's all this overuse of these words, these sort of big words he's using that try and kind of create this feeling that he has, and so it kind of it is what you would expect a scientific sort of writer, a technical writer would create. If they were sort of trying to be literary. So yeah, that's what it's about. And with that said, it tries to be mocking and have fun. Like it's amusing. It's not to be taken too seriously.
So with the end result, how many pages did you end up writing? Was it 158?
It was 158. I could have just 2 more pages and I would have got to a round figure of some kind, wouldn't I? 160. What does that mean? 160 probably has some relevance in the universe. I'll ask universe, what does 160 mean? Nothing. 158 is more important. Oh, yeah, I'll go with it. I don't know. Anyway, I got to 158 and that wasn't intentional. I just wrote the story out and stopped writing when the story finished.
158 pages is a lot to do that. Was that your first proper book, so to speak, that you've written? Yeah.
Well, it was sort of a bucket list thing in a way.
Oh, okay.
The thing is that I wouldn't have written it if I didn't have the story in my head. And I had the story there, and it was a great screenplay in my mind. That's what I read it as. And I thought, this is never going to turn into a movie because the industry is the way that it is. And I was bitter and angry, and I thought, no, it's never going to happen. And I thought, hey, wait on a moment. This actually can happen. I can just project this movie onto the blank canvas of other people's imaginations and let them bring to the story all their own interpretations and experience. And I thought, yeah, what is that? What do they call that thing? Oh, that's right, it's a novel. Yeah, that's what it is, a novella. So that's what I ended up writing. So yeah.
How long did it take you to construct? Because did you do it sporadically with your other ventures, such as film, stand-up comedy, or...
I think there was a bunch of dedicated time, and then it was the time that was also broken up a bit. But over the course of about 8 months, the whole thing happened from start to finish. So, and I guess that was quite quick. And I would say only because I read it now and I realise, well, it's not really finished. There are some other things that can be done to it. So I've published something that is in the final stages of being finished. So even though I say it took 8 months, it's taken 8 months to get to the point it is now.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean I feel like it's necessarily finished.
So did I understand you correctly when you said the intention was to originally write it as a screenplay?
Yeah.
Or... Okay.
So hopefully it reads that way. It reads like it's meant to be watched and not read. I don't know if it does that necessarily. I think it does, just by way of the fact that I saw the whole thing as pictures, really, as a film, kind of running through my head. I suppose most writers would do that.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about it too much, but so I would like to. I think it'd work really well as a film, but it needs to. I think it needs to have more accessibility before it can start being sort of shoved under the noses of the right kind of people who may or may not make that happen. Because it's set in England, it's not set in Australia either. So that's another thing where it's kind of like, how do we, who's that person to help make that happen in another country?
Yeah.
Like that's another step of, But then of course there are degrees of separation which often are not really that cavernous, like that. The gap is really not that big. It's just a matter of starting to make the inquiries. And once I've maybe done another edition, I'll probably feel more confident about it, and we'll start making those inquiries. So I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Is that one of the main attributes to have as a stand-up comedian, or as when you're making films? Is the writing? Do you consider yourself as a writer, a stand-up comedian? What do you think? What would you label yourself as?
I think that if you're involved in comedy, you are writing, they say. And even the pros these days, the guys who have been doing it for years, who literally don't really put pen to paper anymore, they'll often just kick off with a premise, something that may have even occurred to them that day, and then they'll unpack the idea on stage in front of an actual audience. They will still refer to that process as writing.
Yeah.
So I suppose in that way, like, you are a writer. And as that idea becomes more sort of loose, especially, if you rely on Siri to actually take your notes for you, which happens, trust me, then you are less and less actually involved in the physical act of writing. But doesn't mean that you're not forming your ideas in a certain way that is consistent with recording of stuff, which is what writing really is.
So if you had I'm not sure how long your stand-up comedies go for in general, like in terms of duration, but say if you had a 20-minute, well, that's probably a bit too long, 10 minutes?
20 minute would be a headline spot at a reasonably professional room. So 20 minute spot is a headline spot anywhere, but if you want to strictly call it a headliner, then you're sort of paying that person something. So that 20 minutes headline spot, 25 minutes probably headline spot. Most rooms, 15 minutes is sort of like a support spot, maybe a bit less than that, 12 maybe. And then in the open sort of mics area, you've got anywhere between 5 to 10, most commonly 5 minutes. So within 5 minutes, I'm probably going to try and get in 8 to 10, maybe 10 to 13 kind of my length of jokes. I should try and be doing more than that, and that's one thing I'm working on at the moment, is just to try and get shorter and shorter with my ideas. And laughs per minute's really important. So the higher your laughs per minute are, the more bankable, I guess, the more you're worth. Of course, they've got to be good laughs.
But my question was going to be, with that time duration, say if you did a 20 minutes or whatever, how much would you on average need to cut out from I think one comedian I follow, Joe Rogan. He said it's kind of like the process of, if you have like 20 minutes of comedy, you have like another hour of murder where you're just like murdering your like jokes.
Oh yeah, so he's talking about writing an actual show and having, see, like a lot of comedians will say they'll get booked to do a headline spot and they've got their best 20, they've got their best 20 minutes ready to go. So over the course of a number of gigs, a number of 20-minute spots, like years worth, they've honed that 20 minutes. And in the process of doing so, yeah, they've probably got rid of more than they end up with, which is your question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you're right. And that's what I was alluding to earlier, is that when you have a premise and you've got an idea and it's something that might have just occurred to you when you're sitting on the tram or whatever, you then go home and you think, right, I'll write that down. And then you think, okay, following that format, I can write down another 100 ideas in that. 10 of them will be good.
Yeah.
And the other 90 will be terrible. And so, and it doesn't really matter, I don't think it matters how you attack comedy, whether you unpack ideas on the stage, you never write a word down, you're still going to get that sort of ratio happening. So it's much like an iceberg. You'll have the bit that the audience sees at the top is very small, and the bigger part of the iceberg, like, is quite big. It's quite huge. You don't see. It's under the water. And that's what makes it look so effortless. That's why people think, oh, man, he's just thinking up this stuff in the spot. Like, it's interesting, those guys who do a lot of MC work, and that sometimes involves interacting with the audience, if they feel comfortable doing that. So they're the guys who run the night, basically. They bring the comedians on stage and keep the energy alive in the room and blah, blah, blah. So those guys will appear to have these fantastic comebacks for people in the audience, and they'll start building these conversation relationships and think, how is they doing that, and thinking of this stuff. And you go and see them again and they've got the same things they keep saying to different people, because there are certain things that you can say within within that sort of situation that you can sort of transpose to any audience, you know. And so even though it does appear in many ways to be a kind of spontaneous thing, a lot of comedians will do that. Say, today I was just walking down the street. Like, the biggest lie you've ever heard on stage. And most of the audience sort of know that too. Let's get back to this thing of, suspending disbelief. The audience will go, sure, yeah, just thought of it today. Did you? No worries. That's fine. Like, we're willing to accept that as an audience. However, we know it's not true. So anyway.
Yeah, so when did you...
Iceberg.
We're nearly done, but before the podcast ended, we said you must explain what the dot what is.
Oh, the dot what?
Yeah.
Okay, so the dot what, and the dot what is like my little production company that puts on everything that Adam Jacobs does, which is me. So I'm putting on me. Okay. So the dot what, which is THEDOTWOT.com. Yeah. The dot what is the name of my first show that I put on, full-length solo show that I put on at Adelaide Fringe. And I had this show, it was a show dedicated to a piece of punctuation. So I was positioning myself as like a spokesperson, a guru, a spiritual guru, representing not God or some other notion of spirit or supreme being, but a piece of punctuation, otherwise known as a dot. So the dot what was the name of my first show, solo show that I put on at the Adelaide Fringe Festival, which was just really full of a whole bunch of short jokes that in many ways just never really connected with any notion of what it is to worship a piece of punctuation. So there we go. Absolutely.
Well, yeah, Adam, I just want to thank you so much for coming on. This was very enlightening podcast, especially when you're talking about like obscurity, and because there's a lot more thinking that goes on than just like pure comedy. So yeah, thanks, Adam, for coming on the Jono Talks podcast.
No worries. Thank you, Jono Talks.
All good.